Close your eyes for a moment. Try to imagine the world 50 years from now. Really try. Picture society, technology, how people live, how they work, how they relate to each other. What do you see? If you're like most people, you probably see one of two things. Either a dystopian nightmare of environmental collapse, authoritarian surveillance, and social breakdown, or nothing. A blank space where the future should be. Maybe you see the same world we have now, just with better phones and electric cars. What you probably can't see is a genuinely different world. A world organized around different principles, with different priorities, different relationships between people. A world that's actually better than the one we live in now. Not just more technologically advanced, but fundamentally more just, more humane, more sustainable. This isn't your personal failure of imagination. This is what the late Marxist cultural critic Fredric Jameson called the political unconscious at work. The system hasn't just captured your labor, your consumption, your daily activities. It has captured your ability to imagine alternatives to itself. Jameson spent his career studying what he called late capitalism, not just an economic system, but a total cultural condition that colonizes imagination itself. And what he discovered is both terrifying and liberating. Your inability to envision a better future isn't natural. It's manufactured. It's the result of specific cultural and ideological processes designed to make the current system appear as the only possible world. But here's what Jameson understood that gives us hope. Once you recognize how your imagination has been colonized, you can begin the work of decolonizing it. The future hasn't disappeared. It's been hidden. And what's been hidden can be recovered. The question isn't whether a better world is possible. The question is whether you'll allow yourself to believe it's possible, and whether you'll do the cultural and political work necessary to make it real. Jameson identified something unprecedented in human history. We live in the first era where utopian thinking has been systematically eliminated from mainstream culture. Previous generations, no matter how oppressed or limited their circumstances, maintained the ability to imagine radically different futures. Medieval peasants dreamed of lands of plenty. Enslaved people envisioned freedom. Workers imagined societies without bosses. But late capitalism has achieved something no previous system managed. It has colonized the future itself, making alternatives to the present order literally unthinkable. Think about contemporary science fiction, which used to be the space where alternative futures were explored. Today's science fiction is almost entirely dystopian or post-apocalyptic. We can imagine the end of the world more easily than we can imagine the end of capitalism. Movies like Mad Max or The Hunger Games present futures that are worse than the present, not better. Even supposedly optimistic visions like Black Panther or Star Trek still operate within fundamentally capitalist frameworks. They just imagine more benevolent versions of current power structures. This isn't accidental. Jameson argued that late capitalism requires the colonization of utopian thinking to maintain itself. If people could clearly envision better alternatives, they would work to create them. By eliminating the cultural capacity for utopian imagination, the system eliminates the psychological basis for revolutionary change. The result is what Jameson called the prison house of language, a cultural condition where the very concepts necessary for imagining alternatives have been systematically eliminated from public discourse. You can't think thoughts for which you lack words, and late capitalism has been remarkably successful at removing the vocabulary of genuine alternatives from common usage. Words like revolution, collective ownership, economic democracy, post-capitalism sound archaic or impossible. not because the realities they describe are impossible, but because the cultural apparatus has trained you to hear them as unrealistic. The system doesn't need to suppress these ideas through censorship. It suppresses them by making them sound absurd to ears trained by capitalist culture. But Jameson's analysis goes deeper than simple suppression of alternatives. He identified how late capitalism has learned to commodify its own criticism, turning dissent into products and resistance into market opportunities. This is more insidious than censorship because it gives people the feeling of opposing the system while actually strengthening it. Consider how rebellion has been packaged and sold. Punk rock, once a genuine expression of working-class anger, became a fashion aesthetic sold in shopping malls. Hip-hop, which emerged from communities devastated by capitalism, became a vehicle for celebrating capitalist success. Environmentalism, which should challenge the growth-based economy, became green capitalism and sustainable consumption. Even explicitly anti-capitalist imagery gets absorbed and monetized. You can buy Che Guevara t-shirts made in sweatshops, read critiques of capitalism published by multinational corporations, watch documentaries about inequality on platforms owned by billionaires. Jameson called this reification, the process by which even oppositional consciousness gets turned into things to be bought and sold. Your resistance becomes your consumer identity. Your politics become your brand. Your critique of the system becomes a product of the system. This commodification of dissent serves a crucial ideological function. It makes people feel that they're resisting the system when they're actually participating in its reproduction. You feel politically engaged because you buy fair trade coffee, watch documentaries about corporate corruption, and vote for progressive candidates. But all of these activities are structured as consumption rather than genuine political action. The genius of this system is that it channels oppositional energy into forms that ultimately serve capital. Instead of organizing to change the conditions that create exploitation, you consume products that make you feel better about exploitation. Instead of working to eliminate poverty, you buy products that donate small percentages to charity. Instead of challenging the fundamental logic of the system, you purchase slightly more ethical versions of the same products. Jameson famously argued that we live in what he called the postmodern condition, a cultural logic that makes historical thinking impossible. Postmodernism isn't just an art movement or academic theory. It's the cultural dominant of late capitalism, a way of experiencing reality that eliminates the possibility of imagining systematic change. The postmodern condition is characterized by what Jameson called the perpetual present, a temporal experience where the past becomes a collection of styles to be consumed and the future becomes impossible to conceive. History isn't a process of development and change, it's a warehouse of aesthetic options. The 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s become fashion choices rather than periods with their own social dynamics and possibilities. This temporal flattening serves ideology by making change appear impossible. If all historical periods are just different styles available for consumption, then the idea that society could fundamentally transform becomes nonsensical. Progress isn't about moving toward different kinds of social organization. It's about having access to more consumer choices from different historical periods. You can see this everywhere in contemporary culture. Movies endlessly recycle plots and aesthetics from previous decades. Fashion cycles through retro styles. Music samples from earlier eras rather than creating new forms. Architecture combines elements from different periods without regard for their original contexts or meanings. This recycling isn't just nostalgia, It's a symptom of a culture that has lost the capacity for genuine innovation because it has lost the capacity for historical thinking. When you can't understand the present as a historically specific moment that emerged from particular conditions and could be transformed by human action, you can't imagine futures that are genuinely different from the present. But Jameson's most influential insight concerns what he called the spatial logic of late capitalism. The way that contemporary capitalism organizes space in ways that make collective action and alternative imagination practically impossible. Consider the shopping mall, which Jameson analyzed as the paradigmatic space of late capitalism. The mall creates a controlled environment that channels behavior toward consumption while preventing political organization. You can shop, eat, and be entertained, but you can't organize, protest, or engage in meaningful political discussion. The space literally shapes consciousness by making consumption feel natural and political action feel impossible. This spatial organization extends far beyond malls. Suburban design isolates people in individual units, connected only by roads designed for private vehicles. Workplaces are designed to maximize productivity and surveillance while minimizing worker solidarity. Public spaces are increasingly privatized or designed to discourage lingering and conversation. Even digital spaces operate according to this logic. Social media platforms create the illusion of connection and political engagement while actually fragmenting communities and channeling political energy into ineffective forms. You can express outrage, share articles, and engage in political debates, but these activities don't translate into collective power or systematic change. Jameson argued that this spatial organization creates what he called cognitive mapping problems. People lose the ability to understand their position within larger social and economic systems. When you can't map your relationship to broader structures of power, you can't imagine how those structures could be changed. The result is political action that feels meaningful to individuals, but has no systematic impact. People engage in what they experience as political activity, voting, protesting, consuming ethically. But these activities don't challenge the fundamental organization of power because they're structured by spatial arrangements that prevent collective consciousness and action. Drawing on the Frankfurt School, Jameson analyzed how late capitalism has perverted the Enlightenment promise of reason and progress. Instead of reason leading to human emancipation, instrumental rationality has become a tool for more sophisticated forms of domination. Instead of progress creating better conditions for human flourishing, technological development has created new forms of surveillance and control. This isn't because reason or progress are inherently bad, but because they've been subordinated to the logic of capital accumulation rather than human need. Artificial intelligence could eliminate most forms of tedious labor, but under capitalism it's used to eliminate jobs and concentrate wealth. Renewable energy could create abundance and sustainability, but under capitalism it becomes another market opportunity that must compete with fossil fuels on profit margins rather than social benefit. The tragedy of late capitalism is that it has created the technological and organizational capacity to solve most major human problems: poverty, disease, environmental destruction, material scarcity, but it can't implement these solutions because they wouldn't be profitable or would threaten existing power structures. Jameson called this the dialectic of enlightenment under late capitalism. The way that our greatest achievements in knowledge and technology become obstacles to human flourishing when they're organized according to capitalist logic. The very capabilities that could create a better world become weapons against the possibility of a better world. This creates a profound form of cultural pessimism that masquerades as realism. People accurately perceive that current institutions are inadequate to address major problems, but they can't imagine different institutions because the cultural apparatus has eliminated the conceptual tools for thinking institutionally. The result is cynicism disguised as sophistication, despair disguised as wisdom. Perhaps Jameson's most important contribution is his analysis of what he called the political unconscious. The ways that capitalist ideology operates below the level of conscious awareness, shaping desire, imagination, and perception in ways that make alternatives to capitalism psychologically unavailable. This isn't just about propaganda or manipulation, though those exist. It's about the deeper cultural processes that structure consciousness itself. The stories you tell about yourself, the way you understand success and failure, the forms of pleasure and beauty that seem natural to you, the temporal rhythms that organize your daily life. All of these are shaped by capitalist culture in ways that make capitalist social relations feel inevitable. For example, the idea that competition is natural and motivating isn't based on biological or psychological evidence. It's a cultural belief that supports capitalist economic organization. But it's so deeply embedded in the culture that it feels like common sense rather than ideology. When you can't imagine motivation without competition, you can't imagine economic systems based on cooperation and mutual aid. Similarly, the idea that innovation requires private property and profit incentives isn't supported by historical evidence. Most major innovations throughout history were developed through collective effort and public funding. But the cultural narrative that links innovation to entrepreneurship is so powerful that alternative forms of innovation become literally unthinkable. Jameson argued that these unconscious cultural beliefs are more powerful than explicit ideology because they operate through desire and identification rather than rational argument. You don't consciously choose to believe that competition is natural. You feel it in your body as excitement, anxiety, and motivation. You don't rationally conclude that private property is necessary. You experience ownership as a form of identity and security. But Jameson's analysis contains hope precisely because it's dialectical. If capitalist culture has repressed utopian thinking, then utopian thinking continues to exist in repressed form, ready to return when conditions allow. If alternatives have been made unthinkable, then the work of making them thinkable again becomes a concrete political task. Jameson identified what he called utopian impulses that persist even within capitalist culture, moments when people glimpse possibilities beyond current arrangements. These might appear in popular culture, in social movements, in technological developments, or in everyday experiences of cooperation and solidarity. The key is learning to recognize these utopian impulses and to understand their political significance. When people work together to help neighbors during disasters, they experience forms of social organization based on mutual aid rather than market exchange. When artists create work that can't be commodified, they demonstrate forms of human activity that exist outside capitalist logic. When communities organize to resist gentrification or environmental destruction, they develop forms of collective decision-making that prefigure post-capitalist democracy. These experiences are often dismissed as unrealistic or temporary, but Jameson argued that they contain the seeds of alternative futures. The task isn't to impose utopian blueprints on reality, but to recognize and develop the utopian possibilities that already exist within current conditions. This requires what Jameson called dialectical thinking, the ability to see the present as historically specific and therefore changeable, to recognize contradictions within current arrangements that point toward different possibilities, and to understand how elements of the future already exist in embryonic form within the present. Jameson understood that revolutionary change requires cultural transformation as much as political and economic transformation. You can't create a post-capitalist society with capitalist consciousness. The cultural apparatus that makes capitalism seem natural must be dismantled and replaced with cultural forms that make alternatives seem possible and desirable. This doesn't mean that cultural work replaces political organizing, but that cultural and political work must proceed together. People need to be able to imagine better worlds before they'll be willing to struggle for them. They need new stories, new images, new forms of art and entertainment that make different ways of living seem attractive and achievable. But Jameson was clear that this cultural work can't be accomplished through individual artistic production alone. It requires collective cultural projects that prefigure the kinds of social relations that would exist in a post-capitalist society. Community arts projects, cooperative media production, participatory cultural events. These create opportunities for people to experience alternative forms of social organization while creating cultural products that make those alternatives visible to others. The goal isn't to create propaganda for predetermined political positions, but to create cultural spaces where genuine alternatives can be explored, experimented with, and developed. This requires what Jameson called cognitive mapping, cultural work that helps people understand their position within larger systems and envision how those systems could be transformed. So how do you escape what Jameson called the prison house of language and begin to imagine genuine alternatives? The first step is recognizing that your inability to envision better futures isn't natural or permanent. It's the result of specific cultural conditions that can be changed. Jameson advocated for what he called dialectical criticism, forms of cultural analysis that reveal the historical specificity of current arrangements and identify contradictions that point toward different possibilities. This means learning to see the present as one moment in an ongoing historical process rather than as the end of history. It also means developing what Jameson called utopian hermeneutics, ways of reading culture that identify utopian impulses even within works that seem to support the status quo. Every cultural product contains contradictions between the world it depicts and the world it unconsciously wishes for. Learning to read these contradictions is a way of recovering suppressed possibilities. But perhaps most importantly, Jameson emphasized the need for collective cultural work. Individual imagination is limited by individual experience, but collective imagination can transcend those limitations by bringing together different perspectives and possibilities. The future becomes imaginable when groups of people work together to envision and create it. This might take the form of participatory planning processes that involve communities in envisioning their own futures. It might involve collaborative artistic projects that explore alternative ways of living. It might involve study groups that read utopian literature and discuss its relevance to contemporary conditions. It might involve community organizing that prefigures the democratic processes of a post-capitalist society. The key is that imagining the future becomes a collective practice rather than an individual consumer choice. Instead of waiting for Hollywood to provide you with visions of better worlds, you participate in creating those visions with others who share your desire for change. Jameson leaves us with both a diagnosis and a prescription. The diagnosis: late capitalism has systematically colonized imagination to prevent people from envisioning alternatives. The prescription: collective cultural work to decolonize imagination and recover the capacity for utopian thinking. Your inability to imagine a better future isn't a personal failing. It's a political problem with political solutions. The system made sure you can't imagine alternatives, but what the system has done can be undone. The future hasn't disappeared. It's been hidden behind layers of cultural conditioning that tell you it's impossible. But every moment of cooperation, every experience of genuine solidarity, every glimpse of human possibility beyond current arrangements is evidence that different worlds are possible. The task isn't to wait for someone else to imagine the future for you. It's to join with others in the collective work of imagining and creating the world you want to live in. The future is still there, waiting to be discovered. The question is whether you'll do the cultural and political work necessary to find it.